right, we're back for another shootout. It's actually been a minute since I've recorded a video about a vinyl shootout, and I wanted to tackle one of the recent original jazz classics titles, and that is The Cats, which is credited to Tommy Flanagan. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm actually going to do a little bit of a comparison, a shootout, with a Blue Trident copy, which admittedly is a little bit problematic, but I think is still going to allow me to kind of provide you at least my thoughts and context about this new release. So as always, before we get started, hit like and hit subscribe, because these are the ways that you can let YouTube know that you like this type of content, and then they recommend it to others, right? And so that helps me out quite a bit. You can also head over to Instagram and follow me at what_can_brown. I post there, gosh, every other day, always talking about new music, or actually frequently what I do is whether I'm talking about new music or old music is I'll grab something off the shelves and I'll kind of like do a 1-paragraph or 2-paragraph review on that pretty much every day. So if you can't get enough of me and you're waiting for my 1 or 2 videos a week, head over to Instagram. You can follow me there and get even more content. Okay, so here is the album. As I said, it's Tommy Flanagan's The Cats. So you might say that this cover doesn't exactly make it clear about who the leader is, except a couple of things. I mean, one is simply that Tommy Flanagan is the first artist that is listed there. He's also the first artist listed right here on the back, and then on the list of musicians, he comes up first. But maybe more importantly, he wrote every title, every composition on this album except for one, and that one title that he didn't write, it's actually the Tommy Flanagan Trio performing it. So I think we can all agree that this is a Tommy Flanagan album, and it being a Tommy Flanagan album, I think is a little bit important because he didn't record that much as a leader. In fact, this is the second album that Tommy Flanagan ever put out as a leader. And this happened to be borderline shelved for several years. But the first album that he ever recorded was Overseas. So this is Tommy Flanagan Trio on Prestige 7134. This happens to be an Analog Productions reissue because I cannot afford the thousands of dollars that this original record has gone for. In fact, for years, like 10 years ago, it was going for thousands of dollars. It's always been a desirable title, and it must not have sold very well. They must not have pressed very many, and maybe that played a role in this particular album, The Cats, getting essentially shelved. So, like I said, this idea that it was shelved, it was recorded in 1957. I want to say like April of 1957, and it wasn't put out until 1959. So I think we can kind of agree that basically means it's shelved. But this, like I said, this was the second album that he ever put out as a leader, and then the third album that he ever put out as a leader was on Moodsville. And I know that this video is not about these records, but as an aside, this is a phenomenal record. And the funny thing is that it's kind of a less inspired cover, and so sometimes this thing will not go for very much. But I assure you, if you can find one of these that's not on recycled vinyl, which is very important, this is a phenomenal record. It's still the Tommy Flanagan Trio, just the same as Overseas is, obviously with a different lineup. I think it's a different lineup anyway. Yeah, but yeah, it's much less expensive. So you should look out for Moodsville number 9, Tommy Flanagan Trio. So regarding this one though, I would say that it's very interesting to me that it was shelved. And so why I say that is because as soon as you realize that, all right, it was shelved for 2 years, and then you're like, why did it come out in December of 1959? And then you look at what was happening at the time. I personally think that a big reason is because Coltrane had already left Prestige. So this is something that Bob Weinstock did quite a bit, is that when an artist, especially Coltrane, would leave, he basically flooded the market with Coltrane releases so that he could kind of capitalize too by having a new Coltrane release, even though Coltrane was not signed to Prestige anymore. So what was happening in December of 1959 is that he, and funnily enough, Tommy Flanagan, were in the studio recording Giant Steps for Atlantic. And so I think that is why that this album even sort of was dusted off the shelf and brought forward and put out by Prestige just 2 months before Giant Steps was going to be released. All right, so a brief word about what we have here in terms of this. I'll call it a sonic comparison, but really I'm going to just kind of mention my Blue Trident copy and then move on, I think. So again, this is the OJC title that Craft Recordings just put out. right, in what, like November, December, something like that. So I know I'm late to the game on doing this video. This is the Blue Trident copy that I have. And, you know, funnily enough, with new jazz titles that were then reissued on Blue Trident, typically you don't necessarily see laminated covers. And that's one of the reasons that even though it was Blue Trident, I decided to pull the trigger, because I thought laminated copy, surely this is going to be a good sounding one. And unfortunately, it's not. So let me kind of give you some details. So first of all, this is what... some like hairs on this. This is what the label looks like, right? So it's Blue Trident, right? So that's what they call it, that because of the logo there, the trident and the blue. This is an RVG stamped copy. However, it's also on recycled vinyl, and this one doesn't make it as apparent that it's on recycled vinyl, although there is some weird kind of texture to the runout, but otherwise, when I got it in, I thought that this for sure was going to be something that wasn't recycled and wasn't going to have the corresponding hiss sound. So for those of you who haven't watched my video before that, I think I did this like over a year ago. I did a video on specifically recycled vinyl on Prestige and how it corresponds with this audible hiss that just, it's a noise floor that pervades the entire recording. And unfortunately, this has that. Now, don't get me wrong, you don't hear it that frequently. It's really only in the some of the quiet sections of the album. But still, this is just it's not a great sounding recording, or excuse me, this is not a great sounding copy of the vinyl. And therefore, it was just so obvious to me that even though I have this early edition, I had to get the Craft OJC edition, and surely this would be my playing copy. Or at least, you know, that was my thought process. So anyway, these are the two copies that I have, and kind of what I wanted to talk about. And apologize, I haven't listened to an original copy before, but I think I can still at least evaluate this one on its own merits. All right, so just kind of a word, I guess, on this Blue Trident copy. So as I said, recycled vinyl. There is a thin sound on this, and I hope folks know what I mean when I say thin. It's not very dynamic, especially up front, and especially up front on both sides. It's almost like the Idris Suleiman, who's the trumpet player on this thing. It's almost like his tone is like pinched a little bit. It's just really thin. The bass is barely there. The whole thing sounds compressed. And I don't know if that's because it's the original, that's how the original recording was put out, or if it's because it's the impact of this recycled vinyl. But as I said, there's a low noise floor of static across the entire thing and some corresponding pops that, you know, and it's not because it's not because it's in bad shape. It's because it's pressed on recycled vinyl. So again, obviously I had to get the reissue. Here's the thing. When you have a record that is recycled or it's not in good shape, like, it makes you feel good that you have it, yes, but you're not going to pull it very often. And even if it does hit the platter, you're not really going to enjoy it very much. So, I was really meh on this album up until this OJC reissue. Like, that's when I got sort of, it reinvigorated my interest in this album, because I just figured that it was like, you know, something that I shouldn't pay attention to because it doesn't sound very good. If there is a well-recorded track even on this recycled vinyl copy, I would say that it's the trio track. So there's 5 tracks here. 4 of them have the entire group, right? The entire sextet, which I haven't even mentioned. So Tommy Flanagan, John Coltrane, Idris Suleiman, Kenny Burrell, Doug Watkins, and Lewis Hayes. Great lineup. But if there is a track that even sort of transcends the recycled vinyl and sounds good on this, it's the trio track, which is How Long Has This Been Going On? And it just sounds really good. And I would say, I'm biased because this is probably my favorite version of that song that's ever been recorded. And so I'm going to like it. But there's lots of brushwork by Lewis Hayes here. The bass line has more clarity, I would say, in the trio format versus the sextet format. And Flanagan's piano, again, even on this, it sounds a little bit distant, but it does it in kind of like a melancholy sort of sound that actually works in a way, given the nature of the track. So still though, this copy is not how you should hear this album, and so that is why I had to go for the original Jazz Classics, which, by the way, is considerably cheaper than even this recycled vinyl copy would go for. So let's put that on the table. However, what I would say about this album, keeping in mind it's 1957, is that this sounds like a 1957 recording, and not necessarily in a good way. Now, obviously, we have to evaluate it for what it is. It's not like you can just say, "Oh, how about like why I want to hear this as if it was recorded in a more modern time frame, or as if it was recorded in the Englewood studio versus the Hackensack studio of Rudy Van Gelders that it was recorded in." We can't adjust for any of that. So we kind of have to evaluate this album for what it is. Still, the first song, which is Minor Mishap, it's thin as well on this. So Idris Suleiman's tone, don't get me wrong, solo is good, but his tone sounds thin and it doesn't sound very good. When Coltrane comes in, he definitely sounds better. But I would also say that Louis Hayes' cymbals sound pretty tinny on this recording, specifically on the first song. The first song's different than the rest for some reason. I think what saves the first song are the dynamics, especially from Coltrane's solo, because he plays sort of loud and soft, and it adds a little bit more interest to it. Flanagan's piano is not very audible, I gotta be honest, and he's the leader. You want him to be audible on this, and he's just really not, especially when he's competing with Coltrane, not only on this track, but also throughout. When he's competing with Coltrane, I say competing, when he's backing up Coltrane, you barely hear him, and I kind of want to hear him. It shouldn't just be to give Coltrane something to inspire his solo. I feel like I want to hear it too. Kenny Burrell, who I haven't mentioned really yet, sounds good for his solo, but again, the piano behind him is barely audible. Later on in this track, Idris Suleiman comes back in, and his tone does sound more full, almost like something's been adjusted in the meantime. And so I don't know if it was just an issue with that upfront section for him. I would just say, generally speaking, the challenge that I have with this opening track is that Flanagan is a little bit lost. So it's not uncommon for me to have problems, I would say, with individual tracks and then be like basically backtracking on other tracks. And that may be the case here. And again, I'm not blaming Kraft here. I'm not blaming OJC and the series. I just think that sometimes certain tracks sound better because of how well they were recorded. And here's the thing, maybe some of these issues are the reasons why this wasn't originally put out by Prestige and it was shelved. But anyway, what I would say in the second track, How Long Has This Been Going On, which I said was one of my favorite tracks on the, in the prior version, in that trio piece here on this version, Flanagan sounds phenomenal. Watkins's bass is much fuller here, and the brushes feel like the right amount of audibility to have detail but not distract from Flanagan. So they're not incredibly detailed. This doesn't sound like a tone poet pressing. It doesn't. It's 1957, but it sounds more of a balanced track, and it sounds good. Eclipso is the third track on the first side, and it has the horns that are sort of layered that lead into Tommy Flanagan's solo. Tommy Flanagan does kind of a lot of chromatic runs. They're not really chromatic. They're almost like scales, like he's running scales up and down at the beginning. I would say his solo is pretty contained here with a lot of like right hand stuffed, but then it builds slightly in complexity, and it's blues forward, but it sounds really good. So here's the thing. What I'm getting at is I think that the group or the sound or the album just kind of comes together a little bit better the later on into it that you get. Suleiman here on this third track, like Kenny Dorham, his sound is still a little bit thin. He uses so much air, and in some situations I'm even questioning whether he's blowing actual notes or whether it's just air that I'm hearing. But still, I do think that he has nice sort of ideas that are communicated through his solo here. By the way, like randomly, Idris Suleiman, it's kind of weird because I feel like people recognize him from his early stuff in the mid to late 50s, and then he dropped off the face of the earth. So he moved to Europe in 1961, but funnily enough, I think it was because he was on tour there in 1961, and then he just decided to not go back. So he just stayed, and he decided to live there, and he ended up playing with the Kenny Clarke and Francie Boland band for a while. And then I think he stopped playing altogether, but he came back for Miles Davis's album Aura in the mid 80s. Just a weird thing where he probably was living a fantastic life, way better than what he would have in the US. And he kind of left the scene and then he came back. Brief tangent. Anyway, on this last track on side one, Eclipso, so Coltrane takes the solo, and his tone is fantastic, and he kind of saves the piece, especially taking over for Idris. And again, I just think you have to remember when you're thinking about what this album should sound like, You just have to remember, this is 1957. This is 1957 Coltrane. It's not 1960 Coltrane, and audibly there is a difference. Okay, so I could go down each track. I could do exactly what I just did for side 2, but I'm not. I kind of want to sum things up about this release because I think it can be done based on the discussion thus far. So one of the points that I keep hammering home is that this is a 1957 recording and only so much can be done with it. And I guess when I say done with it, I mean this is probably what's on the master tapes. So what that means is that the piano gets lost. When I say lost, I don't mean Tommy Flanagan doesn't know where he is. I mean, you don't hear the piano in the recording as much as you want to. It also means that the soloists are prioritized in the mix at the expense of other musicians. I've mentioned this before, like a half dozen times at least on these older recordings, is that this is how they were recorded. They were prioritizing the solos. The soloists were supposed to stand out and the rhythm was there to help kind of guide them. And so that's how these recordings sound. And all of us want to hear all the musicians, and sometimes we can't, especially with these earlier recordings. The bass is also not as rich on these older recordings as you would expect from something that's even just a couple of years later. And again, all because I think it's a 1957 recording. All right, so that's one. Number two, this reissue sounds significantly better than my Blue Trident pressing, but I'm also going to guess that it sounds better than the original. Typically with these recycled vinyl pressings, yes, there's a noise floor, but still you get a lot of dynamics. You get a lot of the sort of magic out of the recording. And some people in different setups and dedicated mono carts can almost, like, I don't want to say bypass the recycled hiss, but it significantly mutes it depending on the setup. And I think that if that's the case, then that means that the music is still there in this recording. It's just I can't hear it because I hear some of the hiss. So anyway, I do think though that it's very likely that this OJC sounds better than the original pressing. So that's two. The third thing is that there's not a whole lot of sonic detail here, but what you get is a great presentation of a great recording by great musicians. This album is not monumental by any means, because otherwise, let's be real, if it was, Bob Weinstock would have released it in 1957, and instead it was shelved and put out in order to capitalize on probably John Coltrane ahead of his Atlantic records. So it doesn't mean that it's not worthy of your listen. It just means that it's not a classic recording, and there's a variety of reasons that that's probably the case. So number four, and the last point, is that some of the dynamics on this album feel off. When I say off, I mean wrong. Like they're not supposed to sound like this. So the beginning of side one, as I mentioned up front, is a little soft, and the beginning of side two is also a little bit soft. Like I want to go turn it up, but then the problem is that later on it resolves itself with the soloists. Like all of a sudden, like the volume is where it needs to be, and the rest of the recording is fine. So I do not want to suggest that this is a problem with the OJC pressing, because it's also a problem with the Blue Trident copy that I have, and therefore also something that's probably present in the master tapes. However, I feel like I want to turn Flanagan's piano up, especially on a track that I didn't even cover in my discussion. It's the first track on side two, which is Solacium is what it's called. I just feel like I want to go up and just like don't mess with any of the other musicians. I just want to turn up Flanagan because it just doesn't sound balanced. It's weird. So those are kind of my thoughts. Those are my like 4 bullet points of kind of feedback on this album. Is this a worthwhile addition to the OJC series? Absolutely. Like this music should be heard, but this isn't for people looking for a classic recording. It's not people for looking to hear Coltrane at his best, or really any of these musicians at their best. So therefore it is a little bit of a deep cut. It's kind of one of those prestige all-stars types of recordings where no one really stands out per se, but obviously it's well executed, and it's always nice to hear Coltrane as a sideman. It's certainly nice to hear Flanagan as a leader, because we don't have many opportunities to do that. But I would say that both of them do that job better elsewhere. So that's my assessment. Am I disappointed with OJC? No, not at all. I'm really happy to have this version compared to that Blue Trident copy that I had, and I'm going to keep this OJC, and I'm probably going to sell that Blue Trident because this is the version that I want to hear. And yeah, I mean, so I'm kind of, as you can kind of hear, I'm kind of mixed on this thing because I wanted it to sound better, and my guess is that the master tapes are the master tapes. So would love to hear what everyone else thinks about this album in the comments, so feel free to agree or disagree, because here's the thing, I'm at the mercy of this setup that I have in this room, and maybe it sounds different on your setup. So thanks very much, as always, for your attention, and I will see you next time.